Hello guys, Andy from NGB here with a video game review, and today we are looking at Supermassive Games, the Dark Pictures Anthology, Man of Medan on Nintendo Switch. But before we get on with that review, you know what time it is. It's time for me to tell those 97% of viewers who aren't subscribed to the channel to just go and have a little tap on that subscribe button. It does help us grow as a channel. It does help us deliver our video content more directly to you when we release it, and we are releasing a whole ton of video content at the moment, so go give it a little subscribe, check that bell to get notifications, and yeah, join Club NGB. We're probably not calling it that. Anyway, here's Man of Medan. Originally released in 2019 for PlayStation 4, Xbox One and PC, Man of Medan is the first part of Supermassive Games' Dark Pictures Anthology. You may recognise Supermassive Games as a developer who worked on the PlayStation exclusive Until Dawn and more recently The Quarry. All of these games are story-driven interactive movies, and the Man of Medan is the first of their games to make the jump to Nintendo's Switch. Story-wise, it sees four friends and the skipper of a boat they have chartered head off to the seas to search for sunken treasure, fall foul of pirates along the way, and get embroiled in ghostly happenings on an abandoned World War II naval vessel. There is a large focus on jump scares among the narrative as well early on as some more psychological horror elements. The Dark Pictures Anthology pitches itself as video gaming's Tales from the Crypt, and so far there have been 4 mainline games released in the series across Xbox and PlayStation and PC formats. Man of Medan is the earliest story in this series, and it does feel like the least developed. The stories definitely have improved as the series has gone on, as has the mechanics that underlie them. Man of Medan certainly does take a while to get going, but does deliver some nicely creepy moments as the story progresses. Players will take on different characters in the story through different narrative chapters. In exploration chapters, they will control the characters using a thumbstick, with the A button used to interact with objects in the environment to search for clues and trigger events which can change the ebb and flow of the story. But there are also quick time event sections and multiple choice sections where players can make decisions which will affect the narrative as a whole and affect the relationship between the different characters. These are often split-second decisions which have to be made with a tap of a button or a push of a stick, and can often take the story in different directions. One of the things I did find when I was playing through the story and making the choices for my characters was that it wasn't always clear how the story was going to change with the choices that I made. Now obviously that's a given, but more so, some of the choices that you are offered aren't clear whether they are going to be bad choices or good choices, because your character, and I found this also with games like LA Noire, you could pick a choice and your character might respond in a way counter to how you expected them to respond when you made that choice, which can be quite tricky when you're having to make spur of the moment decisions. This is where Man of Medan is likely to divide players, because it is not an action game. It's not something like a Resident Evil. It's very slow, it's very deliberate. It almost feels sluggish at times with its controls. Moving the characters particularly can feel a little bit cumbersome, but this isn't an action game. This isn't a game where you have to run to escape from things. Often the more frantic action sections are done through the quick time events, which in themselves can be problematic. You don't always get a lot of time to react to the on-screen prompts, and in particular if, like me, you've been playing a lot of Xbox and then jumping back to playing the game on Nintendo Switch, actually triggering QuickTime events on a joystick with different button layout can be quite tricky. I've hit the B button instead of the A button quite a few times, and vice versa with X and Y. But you know, that's a console specific problem. One of the benefits that you do have, though, is the way that the game allows you to replay chapters. So if you decide that perhaps you have not driven the story in a direction that you wanted it to go, you could choose to start the story afresh from the beginning of the chapter that you just finished, and try making different decisions, or try reacting a little bit quicker to some of those quick time events, to try maybe allowing some of the characters to survive, or driving the narrative in a very different direction. Now, as you're playing, the game will give you a few helpful hints as well to identify where the story might be going. You can find pictures, for example, hanging on walls, which give you premonitions as to future events. So when the time comes for you to make a choice in those events, you kind of have an idea as to the direction that things might head, and can potentially change the outcome of those particular events in the narrative. The game also plays with the idea of bookending the stories with a character called the Curator, played here by the actor Pip Torrens, who players might recognise as the voice of Varys from Elden Ring, or in live action as Herr Starr in the HBO series Preacher. And he gives the characters sometimes helpful tips, sometimes distracting tips from his library, where he acts as kind of like a crypt keeper kind of character, where he guides the general feel of the series as it progresses through all of the different storylines of the Dark Pictures Anthology. There are also other recognisable actors within the game. Most recognisable probably is Shawn Ashmore, who you may recognise as Iceman from the X-Men films. As well as the premonitions and the Curator's tips, as you progress the story, the game will also allow you to view character profiles, which will give you an idea of how the characters feel about each other, how they've been interacting with each other throughout the course of the storyline, and maybe give you an idea of how they might react in certain scenarios in the future. These are quite handy, particularly to review as the story progresses, to understand how the relationships between the different characters have evolved, and can help the player to make some decisions on the fly. But having to go into a menu to look backwards and forwards between them can be a little bit distracting from the main story. Obviously, players coming to Man of Medan from other more powerful systems might wonder, how has this game ended up on the Switch? It's pretty visually intense on other consoles. Obviously, being a interactive movie, it has a very cinematic quality to it, especially if you've seen Supermassive Games' other titles, The Quarry, Until Dawn, titles that have a strong reliance on very, very detailed but focused visuals. The answer to that question is, obviously, this is significantly cut back for its Switch release. It is visually inferior to the other consoles and systems that it's on, running here at 24 frames a second, which it is cinematic, yes, 24 frames a second. I know people who are quite sensitive to low frame rates, and I do feel that perhaps a 24 FPS game might not sit well with them. However, again, with the speed of this title, it doesn't necessarily always affect it in a negative way, because it's not an action title, because it's kind of playing out cinematically in front of you. It's not as noticeable in a title that you might have more input into, say a third-person action game or a platform game. The graphics are obviously significantly less detailed as the other consoles as well. There is also a lot of texture pop-in, particularly after a switch between camera angles or or a scene loading in, which can be distracting, especially in scenes where the camera's switching quite a lot. And the frames can also stutter a little bit when cameras switch. Again, depending on the environment, some of the scenes on the boat early on in the story seem to have this effect more than scenes that happen later on in the story when we move to the naval vessel, for example, where things play out a little less frantically for the most part. The characters themselves as well, with there being less detail in the visuals, tend to look a bit waxy, less realistic than they did on the other console and PC releases, which can at times be a bit distracting, but again, this is more prevalent in well-lit scenes, and because the majority of the game is quite dark, it becomes less of an issue. And as the story progresses into these darker areas, that's when the game starts to show its strengths a bit more, with the strong lighting engine as characters are moving around more with torches, illuminating rooms on the naval vessel. It becomes a lot more atmospheric, and some of the technical shortcomings become less of an issue. And it's really quite effective to see the torchlight actually cast some nice shadows. And there are some genuinely creepy moments which, you know, lesser quality visuals aside, are still pretty damn scary. One slightly strange thing I did notice while I was playing the Switch version of Man of Medan is that in the options menu there is an option for HDR settings. Now, the Switch does not have HDR support, and all of the screens that I've plugged it into that have HDR in my house have not responded accordingly. So I'm not sure quite what's going on there. That must be a holdover from the system that it was ported from, either one of the other consoles or the PC, but it seems a little bit of a redundant menu option, unless the Switch has some secret HDR mode that I'm not aware of. Now, this is certainly not the best way to play Man of Medan if you have access to a more powerful system, but it is the best portable way to play Man of Medan unless you're willing to fork out for one of the higher end PC handheld consoles, like the recently announced Asus ROG Ally. Mainly because the Dark Pictures Anthology and the Quarry, which are the Supermassive titles available on PC, are not compatible with Steam Deck at the moment. Now, playing portably with Man of Medan is a really great way to experience the story, particularly if you have a horror-averse partner. You can just plug your headphones in, sit on the couch, and they will be none the wiser to all the spoopiness that's going on in the game. But on the standard Switch LED screen, it can get a little bit dark. It can be quite tricky to see some of the detail in the darker scenes of the game without disabling the auto brightness on the screen. And even then it can get pretty dark. So users of the Switch OLED are likely to find that they have a much better portable experience here. Of course, another Switch benefit with a game such as this is that the Switch has a really good suspend and resume mode. So if you're in the middle of a chapter, you need to go and do something else, perhaps the game hasn't saved recently, you can suspend the game quite easily and go about your business and come back to it where you left it. Obviously this is very hardware specific, but I personally find in games with long stretches of story, like this one, that actually being able to just put the console to sleep in the middle of it makes it a much less stressful experience to play and much easier to actually consume the game in smaller chunks. For players of games like Man of Medan, there is obviously the benefit that these tend to be fairly small titles. You can finish this one, for example, within a period of about 4 to 5 hours. But there is plenty of replayability with being able to go and pick the story back up again, try different choices, try to affect the story in different ways, try and keep different characters alive throughout your playthrough. And there's also the benefit of once you've completed the main story, you unlock an alternative curator's cut of the story, which allows you to play through everything again, but taking on the role of different characters in each of the chapters. So you get to see some of the chapters from a different character's viewpoint and learn a bit more about what happens in the story throughout those interactions. As you play as well, you'll unlock a series of DVD-like extras that will allow you to go behind the scenes on the making of the game. So for anyone with an interest in storytelling or video game development, these are a great additional resource that you can just kick back and watch. In addition to a standard single player experience, Man of Medan can also be played multiplayer, with up to 5 players engaging in couch co-op. However, this is largely just a take it in turns version of the single player game. The alternative is an online co-op mode for 2 players. Players will be able to affect the course of the story and perhaps even cross events over in real time. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to experience that on this Switch version of the game. The Switch version also comes with a number of changes over the console and PC versions previously released. For example, early warnings for QuickTime events, tweakable difficulty settings, improved UI as well, and also an extended chapter in the game, which allows you to experience a bit more of the story as it comes towards its end. So Dark Pictures Anthology is going to be continuing onto a total of 8 games. As I've said, 4 games have been released to date. All 4 of those games are featured in the Dark Pictures Anthology logo that appears at the beginning of this game, but obviously it remains to be seen whether any of them, beyond Man of Medan, are going to be coming to Nintendo Switch. I kind of hope that Man of Medan does well enough that they will do, because it's a very interesting series, especially for any gamers who have an interest in horror storytelling or in the concept of anthology storytelling. It's £17.99, or obviously adjusted for the currency in your country. It is a fairly budget release. It's certainly cheaper than I was expecting it to be on the Switch. It's certainly a good way to play the game, and for any Switch owners who haven't played it on other systems, I would definitely recommend picking it up to give the Dark Pictures Anthology a go. Overall, Man of Medan is an ambitious title to be putting on Nintendo Switch, and while it's perhaps not the best example of Supermassive Games' work, I am giving it a 6.5 out of 10, with the hopes that perhaps Supermassive will be bringing some more of its catalogue to Switch in the future. Thank you very much for watching this review. Hopefully it's helped you learn a little bit more about Man of Medan on Nintendo Switch, maybe influenced you to check it out. If you've enjoyed what you see, drop a comment down below, hit the like button. All of these things are really good for us as a channel and do help us grow, as does subscribing. Please subscribe. And we will see you next time on Next Gen Base. Bye for now.